In the summer of 1972, on a Tuesday afternoon, when the Los Angeles heat made the air shimmer like water, a desperate man pulled a knife on Bruce Lee. The blade was 7 inches long, a carving knife from a kitchen drawer, its handle worn smooth by years of ordinary use. The mundane tasks of survival that had somehow led to this moment of potential violence. What happened next lasted 4 seconds. No blood was shed, no bones were broken, no pride was wounded, and yet those 4 seconds changed a life forever. Not through force, not through dominance, but through something far more dangerous than any physical technique Bruce Lee had ever mastered. The power to choose restraint when every instinct screams for action. Why didn't he strike? By 1972, Bruce Lee was no longer just a martial artist. He was a phenomenon, a Chinese man in a white man's industry, a philosopher with fists that could shatter boards, a movie star who could kill with his bare hands. 3 years had passed since the Green Hornet introduced America to Kato. His films The Big Boss, Fist of Fury, had turned him into a myth, walking among mortals. The weight of that mythology pressed down on him like gravity. Every movement scrutinized, every interaction carrying the potential for confrontation. People expected him to be invincible. They expected him to be everything they imagined a martial arts master should be. Bruce Lee carried more than fame. He carried the weight of being different in a time when different meant dangerous. He carried the expectations of an entire community who saw him as proof that they belonged in America. Every conversation was a potential confrontation. Every walk down the street carried the possibility that someone would challenge him, test him, try to prove that the legend was just a man after all. June 14th, 1972. Lee's private studio in Chinatown, a converted warehouse that smelled of wood polish and sweat and dedicated effort. A place where students came not just to learn how to fight, but how to think. The walls were lined with mirrors that had witnessed thousands of hours of training, wooden floors scarred by countless feet, heavy bags hanging like patient partners. This was Bruce Lee's sanctuary, the place where he could explore the intersection of philosophy and violence without an audience demanding entertainment. Lee had been working with a student for 3 months, a 32-year-old dock worker named Michael Chen. Not his real name. His real name died with him years later. But his story lived on, in the minds of everyone who witnessed what happened that day. Michael Chen was a man built by hard labor and harder choices. Hands calloused from years of loading cargo ships. Eyes that held the particular exhaustion of someone who worked too much for too little and still couldn't make ends meet. Michael Chen was drowning. Gambling debts that had started as a way to make quick money had become a riptide pulling him under. A daughter with chronic asthma, whose medical bills arrived like clockwork, each one a reminder of how little control he had over the forces shaping his life. A marriage crumbling under the pressure of bills he couldn't pay, and dreams he couldn't afford to keep. He'd come to Lee's studio 3 months earlier, walking through that door like a man entering a church, desperate for salvation, but not quite sure what form it might take. He'd heard the stories. Bruce Lee could teach you to fight like a demon, could show you how to break boards with your bare hands, could unlock some secret power that would make you unstoppable. Michael Chen thought martial arts might teach him how to fight his way out of the hole his life had become. But Bruce Lee had other ideas. The highest technique is to have no technique. Lee wrote these words in his private journal 3 months before the incident with the knife. He was surrounded by books that had nothing to do with fighting and everything to do with understanding. Philosophy, physics, psychology. Lee had been studying more than fighting. He was studying control, not of others, but of himself. The ancient texts spoke of Wu Wei, effortless action, of responding to force, not with greater force, but with redirection. But understanding these concepts intellectually was different from living them, different from applying them when adrenaline was pumping and instinct was screaming for immediate action. Lee was learning that true mastery wasn't about perfecting technique. It was about perfecting the space between stimulus and response, the brief moment where choice lived. In every confrontation, Lee told his students, 2 weeks before the incident, there are two battles, the one you can see and the one that matters. He was demonstrating a block that day, not the hard blocks of traditional karate, but something fluid, a redirection that used the attacker's energy against them. The visible battle is what everyone watches. Who hits harder? Who moves faster? But the invisible battle determines everything else. The battle for control of your own mind, your own choice of how to respond to aggression. Traditional martial arts taught that conflict must be won or lost. Lee was discovering something different, that conflict could be dissolved, that the most effective response to aggression might not be counter-aggression, but something requiring more strength than any physical technique. Michael Chen learned the techniques, the footwork, the timing, the body mechanics that turned your frame into a weapon. But he never learned the most important lesson, that the strongest opponent you'll ever face is the one in your own head. Chen approached training like his work at the docks, with grim determination, believing effort alone could overcome any obstacle. He practiced until his knuckles bled, until sweat pooled on the floor, like evidence of his commitment. Lee watched this intensity with growing concern. Chen was learning to fight, but not to think. He was acquiring tools of violence without the wisdom to know when they should remain unused. 3 days before the incident, Lee approached Chen after a particularly intense session. "Michael, what do you think strength looks like?" Chen examined his new calluses. "Strength looks like being able to handle whatever comes at you." Lee nodded, but his expression suggested incompleteness. "And what happens when what comes at you is yourself?" The question hung between them like smoke. Chen didn't have an answer. Not then. A master is not someone who never falls. A master is someone who gets up quickly. And sometimes, getting up means putting down the thing that knocked you down in the first place. June 13th, 1972, 11:47 p.m. The rotary phone in Michael Chen's cramped apartment rang like a bell tolling midnight, cutting through the humid Los Angeles night like a blade through silk. Chen had been sitting at his kitchen table, staring at bills spread before him, like tarot cards predicting a future he couldn't afford. Electric bill, 2 months, overdue. Rent notice, final warning. Medical bills from his daughter's latest hospital visit. Each line item, a small catastrophe, dressed in clinical language. The voice belonged to Marcus the Snake Torino, a loan shark who collected debts with compound interest and broken bones. 24 hours, Chen. You got 24 hours, or we start taking payments in flesh. Chen owed $12,000. In 1972, that was more than 3 years' wages. The debt had started small, a $100 bet on a sure thing at Santa Anita. A horse that couldn't lose, except it did. Chen had fallen into the classic trap of the desperate, believing that the same thing that had destroyed him could also save him. He had learned to punch through wooden boards in Bruce Lee's studio, could break bricks with his bare hands, but none of that could break the stranglehold of compound interest. Chen spent the night pacing through his apartment like a caged animal, opening drawers and closing them again, looking for something that wasn't there, some magical solution that would make the numbers add up differently. His wife slept on the couch, holding their daughter, both of them exhausted by the weight of living in a house where money was always the loudest voice in every conversation. Chen watched them sleep and felt the particular agony of a man who couldn't protect the people he loved most. By morning, Michael Chen had made a decision that would change two lives forever. If Bruce Lee could teach him to fight, maybe Bruce Lee could teach him to survive. And if Bruce Lee wouldn't teach him willingly, maybe fear would be a more effective instructor than patience. Chen looked at himself in the bathroom mirror that morning and saw a stranger looking back, someone he didn't recognize, someone capable of things the old Michael Chen would never have considered. The knife came from the kitchen drawer, 7 inches of carbon steel, worn thin by years of ordinary use. As he wrapped his fingers around the handle, Chen tried to tell himself this was just another tool, like the hammers he used at the docks, like the martial arts techniques he'd learned in the studio. Lee's studio. Tuesday afternoon, 2:15 p.m. The summer heat had turned the converted warehouse into a furnace, but the high windows let in light that transformed the space into something almost sacred. Dust motes danced in the golden beams like tiny spirits. Bruce Lee was alone when Michael Chen arrived. No students, no witnesses, just two men and a truth waiting to reveal itself. Lee had been practicing forms when Chen knocked, the slow movements that helped him center his mind and prepare for whatever the day might demand. Something was different about Chen today. Lee noticed it the moment the door opened. Chen's typical swagger was gone, replaced by something more desperate. His shoulders carried a tension that had nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with psychological pressure approaching its breaking point. Lee had trained his perception, the way others trained their muscles. Years of studying human behavior had given him an almost supernatural ability to read people. He could sense violence, building like a storm system. "You're carrying something heavy today, Michael." It wasn't a question. Lee's voice held the particular gentleness of someone who understood that confronting a desperate person required the same careful approach as handling explosives. Chen stood just inside the doorway, his right hand pressed against his side in a gesture that was meant to look casual, but achieved the opposite effect. Something was concealed beneath his jacket, something that was changing his entire posture. "I need to talk to you about something, Bruce." Chen's voice carried a tremor that had nothing to do with physical fear and everything to do with the sound of a man approaching a point of no return. The voice of someone who was about to do something that would change him forever, and who knew it. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Lee moved away from the center of the room, creating space. His movements were casual, natural, but every step was calculated. Chen's response came not in words, but in the whisper of steel against fabric. The knife emerged like a silver tongue, catching the afternoon light. "I need money, Bruce. I need it now, and you're going to give it to me." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire, just beginning to burn. At this moment, Bruce Lee faced a choice that would define not just his philosophy, but his humanity. Lee could have ended this in a dozen ways. A step to the left would have taken him outside the knife's range. A sweep to Chen's ankle would have put him on the ground. A strike to the wrist would have sent the knife flying. Chen had telegraphed his intention so completely that Lee had time to consider his response, execute it, and still have time to contemplate lunch. But defeating Chen wasn't the challenge Lee faced. The challenge was seeing past the weapon to the human being holding it. The challenge was recognizing that sometimes the most effective response to violence wasn't counter-violence, but something requiring more strength than any technique he had ever mastered. Instead, Lee did something that no amount of training could have prepared him for. He chose to see not the threat, but the man holding it. "Michael," Lee said, his voice barely above a whisper, "look at your hand." Chen's eyes flickered downward to the knife, trembling in his grip. The blade was shaking like a leaf in a hurricane. "What do you see?" The question cut through Chen's rehearsed desperation, like a blade through silk. "I see." Chen's voice wavered like the blade. "I see someone I don't recognize." The admission came out like a confession, carrying the weight of a man discovering something terrible about himself in real time. That's the first honest thing you've said today, Lee replied, his voice carrying no judgment, just recognition of a truth that had been hiding beneath layers of desperation. What happened next lasted 4 seconds in real time, but in the space between heartbeats, in the pause between one breath and the next, a lifetime of choices condensed into a single moment of crystalline clarity. Time seemed to slow, the way it does in moments of extreme consequence. The dust motes in the afternoon light stopped their dance. Even the knife seemed to suspend its trembling, as if the universe itself was holding its breath to see what would happen next. Lee's right hand began to move, but not toward the weapon, not toward Chen's throat or wrist or any of the dozen vulnerable points that years of training had mapped onto his consciousness. Instead, his hand moved toward Chen's left hand, the hand that wasn't holding the knife, the hand that was still human. The movement was so subtle, so unexpected, that Chen didn't react defensively. He was prepared for Lee to attack the threat. He wasn't prepared for gentleness. Lee's fingers made contact with Chen's free hand, the touch so light it might have been imagined. But in that contact, something passed between them. Not force, not domination, something more fundamental, recognition. Feel that? Lee asked, his voice carrying the quiet intensity of someone sharing a secret. Chen's eyes widened, confusion, replacing some of the desperate aggression that had driven him to this moment. The knife began to lower, not from force or fear, but from the simple human response to unexpected gentleness. That's your pulse. Still steady, still strong, still human. The words hit Chen like a physical blow, but one that healed rather than wounded. For weeks, he had been feeling like something other than human, like a machine driven by desperation. Lee's touch, Lee's words, reminded him of something he had forgotten, that he was still a person, still someone's husband, still someone's father. I could take that knife from you, Lee continued, his voice carrying no threat, only fact. I could hurt you badly enough that you'd never threaten anyone again. Is that what you want? Is that who you want to be when you go home tonight? Chen's face began to crumble, the desperate mask giving way to something rawer. I want my daughter to stop crying herself to sleep every night, Chen whispered. I want to be able to look at my wife without seeing disappointment. Then let's solve that problem, Lee said. But not this way. This way only creates more problems. Problems that follow you home and sit at your dinner table and watch your daughter sleep. I'm not your enemy, Michael. I never was. The knife was pointing toward the floor now. No longer a weapon, but simply a piece of metal that had somehow found its way into a desperate man's hand. Chen looked at it, as if seeing it for the first time, wondering how something so ordinary had become part of something so potentially devastating. 5 minutes passed, in complete silence. Chen on the floor, not from defeat, but from exhaustion. Years of carrying weight too heavy for one man. Lee simply standing, present in the moment, allowing Chen to feel the full weight of what just happened. The studio held its breath. The afternoon light continued its slow journey across the wooden floor, marking time's passage in golden rectangles that shifted and changed, like the thoughts moving through two men's minds. Finally, Chen spoke. Why didn't you stop me? You could have had that knife out of my hand before I knew what was happening. Lee considered the question with the same care he brought to everything else. Because stopping you would have only stopped your body. I needed to stop the part of you that wanted to do this. And now? Chen asked. What happens now? Lee smiled. Now we solve your real problem, the one that brought you here. But I don't have any money to pay you back if you help me. Michael, Lee said gently, I was never asking for money. Michael Chen left the studio 2 hours later, walking differently than he had arrived. not with the desperate urgency of a man running toward his last desperate option, with the slower, more thoughtful pace of someone who had time to consider his choices. The knife never left the studio. Chen had placed it on a bench near the door when he finally understood that he wouldn't be taking it with him. Li had made a phone call to whom Chen never knew, and arrangements had been made, not for money, but for opportunity, a chance to work extra shifts, a connection to someone who understood that men sometimes needed more than wages to rebuild their lives. Chen never returned to martial arts training, but what he learned in those 4 seconds would guide the rest of his life. Li had done something more powerful than disarming a desperate man. He had given Chen permission to be human in his moment of greatest inhumanity. In the weeks that followed, Chen began to approach his problems differently. Instead of seeing his debts as insurmountable mountains that required desperate measures to climb, he began to see them as puzzles that could be solved through patience and systematic effort. More importantly, he began to approach other people differently. Where once he would have met aggression with aggression, he began to look for the human being underneath the surface behavior. His co-workers at the dock began to notice. Chen, who had once been known for his quick temper, had become someone people sought out when tensions ran high. Chen's marriage began to heal. His wife, Margaret, later said that Michael came home different that day. Not broken, she clarified. Fixed. Their daughter, Amy, was 8 years old when her father walked into that studio, carrying a knife. She was too young to understand what was happening, but old enough to notice when the weight began to lift from her father's shoulders. Amy would grow up to become a social worker, specializing in crisis intervention. When asked about her inspiration, she would tell the story of her father's transformation, not the story of a man who almost made a terrible mistake, but the story of what happened when someone chose to see the human being instead of the threat. Michael Chen died in 1995, 23 years after the incident. Cancer. But at his funeral, 17 people stood up to speak about how he had changed their lives, through presence, through seeing them when they couldn't see themselves. None of them knew about the knife. None of them knew about Bruce Lee. They only knew Michael Chen as someone who had mastered the most difficult martial art of all, being human. 3 months after the incident, Bruce Lee was asked by a journalist, "What's the greatest opponent you've ever faced?" Lee was quiet for a long moment. "The greatest opponent," he said slowly, "is the one who makes you question whether you need to fight at all." In his private journals, Lee wrote extensively about the experience, not about the physical aspects, but about the moment of choice, when he realized that his greatest strength lay not in what he could do, but in what he chose not to do. "Today I learned that mercy is not weakness disguised as strength," he wrote. "It is strength choosing to be gentle. It is the recognition that the most effective way to defeat an enemy is to help them stop being your enemy." These insights began to influence everything Lee taught. His students noticed that he spent less time on devastating techniques and more time on what he called the space between action and reaction. Lee understood something that most people spend their entire lives trying to learn, that true power isn't measured by what you can destroy, but by what you choose to preserve. The story of the knife was never publicized. Lee never spoke of it in interviews. Chen took the details to his grave, though the transformation it had created lived on in every interaction he had for the rest of his life. Lee would go on to influence generations of martial artists, but perhaps his greatest teaching wasn't captured on film or recorded in his writings. It happened in the space of 4 seconds, when he chose to see a man's humanity instead of his weapon. Young martial artists who studied Lee's philosophy often missed this subtlety. They focused on his speed, his power, his technical innovations. But the students who truly understood what Lee was teaching learned something different. They learned to fight like him by learning how to choose not to fight. Anyone could learn to hurt people, but only those who had mastered themselves could consistently choose the right response to aggression. Whether that response was engagement or avoidance, force or restraint, action or patience, Michael Chen kept a journal in his final years. His final entry, written 3 days before he died, contained only a single sentence. I learned that day that mercy is not the absence of strength. It is strength choosing not to act. The lesson continued to ripple outward. Amy Chen's work with troubled families, Margaret's volunteer work at the community center, the dock workers who had learned conflict resolution from Michael and who taught those skills to their own children. This is how wisdom spreads, not through grand gestures, but through the accumulation of small choices, the patient repetition of better responses to difficult situations. Bruce Lee died the following year, in 1973, at the age of 32. Those who knew him best understood that his true legacy wasn't the movies or techniques he had developed, but the principle he had embodied, that true mastery lies not in perfecting our ability to harm others, but in perfecting our ability to help others discover their own capacity for transformation. The most dangerous thing Bruce Lee ever mastered was himself. In learning to control his own responses, to choose his actions rather than simply react to circumstances, he demonstrated a form of power that was more profound than any physical technique. And in choosing mercy over vengeance, understanding over condemnation, transformation over destruction, he showed that true strength isn't about what we can do to others. It's about what we can choose not to do. It's about the space between stimulus and response, the moment where choice lives, the place where we decide who we want to be. It's about recognizing that every person we encounter is fighting battles we know nothing about, carrying burdens we can't see, struggling with choices that might lead them to desperate measures. It's about understanding that mercy is not weakness, but strength in its most refined form. And it's about the possibility that in any moment of conflict, we might choose to see not an enemy to be defeated, but a human being to be understood. The most dangerous thing Bruce Lee ever mastered was himself, and in mastering himself, he left a path for others to follow.